To all who come to this happy place, welcome. Disneyland is your land.
Disneyland, the original Disney theme park located in Anaheim, California. It's the only one to be created and enjoyed by Walt Disney himself. It's easy to assume it was built by a powerful entertainment empire, led by a ruthless businessman chasing profit. But the truth behind Walt Disney's journey into the creation of Disneyland tells a very different story. Walt grew up in a large working-class family, often taking odd jobs for his father, whose business ventures frequently changed, including a stint running a farm. After serving as an ambulance driver for the Red Cross during the First World War, Walt pursued his passion for drawing, creating short cartoons called Laugh-O-Grams and selling them to Kansas City Film Ad. By 1922, they gained traction, and he started his first studio with a group of young artists, but it quickly folded. Broke and out of options, Walt followed the advice of his older brother, Roy Oliver Disney, and moved to Los Angeles in 1923 with just $40 in his wallet and half a suitcase of clothes. Roy was in a veterans hospital suffering from tuberculosis when Walt visited with news of interest in his animation live-action series, Alice's Wonderland. Seeing an opportunity, Walt convinced Roy to help him launch a new studio. Roy left the hospital and persuaded their uncle to invest $500 and lend them his garage, where the Disney Brothers studio was born. Roy, though frail and gaunt, never returned to the hospital, and his tuberculosis miraculously cleared.
Roy had helped me, and I wanted Roy and I to be partners, that was all. I mean, we just wanted to be partners, you know. Well, Roy not knowing the business, he didn't know what we were in, but Roy had a faith in me, the same as he did when I was in Kansas City. He'd send me those checks.
The Disney Brothers studio, later renamed to Walt Disney Productions, would go on to produce popular shows, movies, and characters. Mickey Mouse was introduced in 1928, making Walt Disney world famous. Then later, the popular Silly Symphonies series pushed the boundary of animation and storytelling. And eventually, the studio would create the world's first full-length animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Where did you originally get the first notion for Disneyland?
Well, it came about when my daughters were very young, and Saturday was always Daddy's Day with the two daughters. So we'd start out and try to go someplace with, different things, and I would take them to the merry-go-round, and I took them different places, and as I'd sit there while they rode the merry-go-round, did all these things, sit on a bench, eating peanuts, I felt that there should be something built, some kind of an amusement enterprise built where the parents and the children could have fun together.
The stories and characters the studio created took the world by storm, and tourists who flocked to Hollywood wanted to visit the Disney studio in hopes of finding something magical. But Walt's studio was nothing more than ordinary offices and sound stages, surrounded by well-tended lawns and rose gardens. Walt needed something that could buffer their disappointment. In the early 1940s, he thought of a themed corner of the studio where visitors could meet their favorite characters, but this project eventually grew into an idea for an 11-acre park across the street. In the early 1950s, Walt had been offering rides on his backyard live steam railroad in Holmby Hills, California. And the sheer number of visitors the railroad received prompted Walt to consider that Mickey Mouse Park idea more seriously. Roy Disney, who was essentially the CEO of the company, was skeptical about opening an amusement park. Even Walt's wife Lillian had said, "Why would you want that? Amusement parks are so dirty and dangerous." Walt simply responded, "That's just it. Mine wouldn't be." Reluctantly, Roy agreed to set aside money for research, and Lillian conceded to go along with it. In early 1953, Imagineer Harper Goff explained to Walt that the current designs of the park exceeded the 11-acre land parcel across from the studio. It wasn't until the Burbank City Council denied his request to build an amusement park that Walt finally admitted it was time to look for land in a different place. To get financial backing, Roy knew a pile of papers with descriptions of the park were not enough to make a convincing pitch, so he asked Walt to have artwork commissioned to help potential financiers to visualize the concept. He turned around and called upon one of his studio's best artists, Herb Ryman, to create the rendering of the park over the weekend. Herb said no. "I'm only just seeing these plans. I don't want to create an embarrassment for you or me."
And he went over and stood in the corner. And he kind of turned around and looked at me and he said, "Will you do it if I stay here with you?" So, of course, Walt, as you know, was a very persuasive person.
The two of them worked throughout the weekend to generate the first image for the park that Walt would later name Disneyland, a name that Ryman lightheartedly joked had sounded somewhat egotistical. The artwork depicted the park with 4 themed lands: a jungle to represent the land of adventure, a futuristic city to represent the land of tomorrow, an Old West town complete with a riverboat to represent the frontier, and a large medieval forecourt with a fairy tale castle to act as the park's visual icon. This represented the land of fantasy, complete with a carousel to pay homage to the idea that started it all. And surrounding the park would be a miniature railroad that would surpass any steam train hobbyist's greatest dream. Roy made arrangements for Walt Disney Productions to allot $10,000 towards the research and development of Disneyland, but when Walt needed more money, Roy suggested he create a private company that would own the rights to Walt Disney's name. That way he could license the name out to Walt Disney Productions, giving him weekly funding for the project. And so Walt created Retlaw Enterprises in the year 1950. It was the name Walter spelled backwards. And by licensing his own name to the bigger company, he received a weekly income of $3,000. Walt hired an architectural firm to design his park, but wasn't satisfied with their concepts. He turned to his friend for advice, the famed architect Welton Beckett. He reviewed Walt's ideas for fanciful architecture built from modern materials. "Walt, no one can design Disneyland for you. We don't have that kind of background for this," Beckett said. "You'll have to use your own people." To build his Magic Kingdom, Walt needed complete control. He didn't want Walt Disney Productions' board of directors voting or vetoing his ideas before they came to fruition. In 1952, he created Walt Disney Incorporated, which was quickly renamed to WED Enterprises the next year. WED stood for the initials of Walter Elias Disney, and it was his newly dubbed team of Imagineers at WED Enterprises that would dream up all of the future things that would go into Disneyland. While Roy was able to get some financial backers such as Bank of America, he still wasn't having much luck. Walt called around to various television studios offering that he could help fund his park in exchange for him starring in a television series he simply called Disneyland. Until then, he continued borrowing money to help pay for the development of his park. He took out $50,000 from his life insurance and then sold his Palm Springs vacation home. When his wife Lillian found out he had spent over $100,000 of their money, she was livid. Walt reminded her that when the park would finally open, Lillian and her daughters would receive a 15% return on any merchandise that visitors bought with his name on it. Still, Lily feared that his plan would only work if the park would open, which seemed increasingly impossible with each passing day. Walt hired a couple of men from the Stanford Research Institute, C.V. Wood and Harrison Buzz Price. Their job was to find the land required for the park. Walt's requirements to Buzz were that he needed 100 acres, which could not be located anywhere near the beach in order to avoid the types of visitors that might show up. And the park would need to be easily accessible from all corners of Southern California. It wasn't easy. Buzz and CV scoured 5 counties, an area roughly 35,000 square miles in size. Eventually, they came back to Walt with a specific parcel, 200 acres of orange and walnut groves in the sleepy rural town of Anaheim, California.
I'm the first guy that saw that site, bar none. It was a bunch of orange groves.
It was cheap land butted up against the still under construction 5 freeway, giving convenient access to both Los Angeles and San Diego. And yet, it was far enough away from the big cities that they could avoid the vagrants and riffraff. C.V. Wood quickly snatched up all 200 acres, sometimes resorting to sneaky tactics to get the farmers to sell. C.V. Wood was a controversial figure that made Walt Disney suspicious of him, but he was a very capable man, and Walt made him vice president and general manager of Disneyland. One of the farm families, by the name of Dominguez, had only one request. On their land were 2 Canary Island date palm trees planted years before, during a family wedding. They hoped Walt wouldn't cut down the trees. Being the sentimentalist that he was, Walt gave his word that the trees would stay standing, a promise that survives even to this day, as the 2 trees are both located adjacent to the Jungle Cruise loading area. Walt had purchased the land using money given to him by Bank of America, but he was still in need of construction funding. Roy went back to New York to request more money, but they refused to lend any more unless Walt could find a major financial backer. It turned out ABC television network was looking to compete with more popular stations and was in need of a big name like Walt Disney to boost its popularity. ABC agreed to fund a large portion of the construction in exchange for Walt starring in the weekly Disneyland TV show and giving them 35% ownership in the park. When Roy left the meeting, he immediately went back to Bank of America to increase their loan to a further $8 million. Disneyland was now funded by a total of $17 million, and almost no one involved was fully convinced the idea would be a success. On July 16, 1954, site leveling began. Walt was adamant that the park would open the next year on July 17th, just 366 days of construction, an impossible deadline even for the mid-1950s. To save money on fully grown trees, horticulture Imagineer Bill Evans suggested keeping some of the orange and walnut trees. He tied special ribbons to the trees, indicating which were to be removed and which would stay. As it turned out, the bulldozer driver was colorblind and had been removing all the trees using his best guess as to which would stay. The contractor arrived on the site and ran out to the bulldozer driver to stop him before he destroyed any more plants. Groundbreaking on Disneyland happened on July 21, 1954, and C.V. Wood brought in retired Navy Admiral turned naval architect Joe Fowler to manage the construction contracts and oversee the work being done. Original construction plans called for the True Life Adventureland to be placed on the east side of the park, but Imagineer Bill Evans discovered a line of mature eucalyptus trees that were planted to shield the farms from the seasonal Santa Ana winds. Evans informed Walt that the trees could protect the jungle foliage if Adventureland was placed on the west side of the park instead. When it came to the landscaping of Disneyland, Walt was inspired by the Tivoli Gardens of Copenhagen and Denmark. Bill Evans had the monumental task of planting up 60 acres of themed park to look like it had been there for ages. The sheer number of foliage he had to purchase for the park easily exhausted both his company's nurseries and all the local ones from Santa Barbara to San Diego, a roughly 80-mile radius from Disneyland. Evans split the landscape design with Imagineer Ruth Shellhorn. She was already an accomplished landscape architect, and she would design the more civilized areas of the park like Main Street, Fantasyland, and Tomorrowland, whereas Bill would create the exotic landscapes of Adventureland and Frontierland. The former of which was particularly troublesome considering that Southern California was a dry coastal plain, but the jungle plants of Adventureland would require humidity and lots of water. With California being so limited on the kinds of plants that were sold, Bill ended up flying to countries around the world and collecting plant specimens for the park. He sometimes sneaked seeds from exotic plants into the country by placing them in his socks. In his effort to acquire the most exotic plants, Bill Evans even discovered a species of plant that would later be named after him, Philodendron evansii. These plants are still alive and well in Disneyland's Jungle Cruise today. Meanwhile, Roy Disney had been worried about how the park was going to turn a profit. Research suggested that merchandise sales alone could carry the financial burdens of the park, but he feared all the Disney merchandise combined could not fill the numerous gift shops around the park. They would have to be rented out to third-party retailers. Park sponsorships could also help ease the cost of operation, but Disneyland was such a risk that no company wanted to accept a sponsorship deal. That was until C.V. Wood managed to convince the Swift Meatpacking Company to agree to operate the Market House on Main Street. Their sponsorship opened the floodgates to around 40 other companies that promptly signed up. Walt was so excited to show off the progress of his park to his friend, television host Art Linkletter, he made him promise that he couldn't tell anyone what he was about to see. Linkletter recalled, "I couldn't believe my eyes. We were driving through orange groves and dirt roads. I didn't tell him what I really thought, that he was out of his mind. After all, it was 45 minutes from where people lived and there was nothing there. The first building completed at Disneyland was the Main Street Opera House, which had a massive floor space used as a lumber mill and machine shop to construct the rest of the park. The next building was a firehouse next to City Hall. Above the firehouse, on the second level, was a tiny one-bedroom apartment for Walt and Lily. During the final stages of construction, Walt would stay overnight on the weekends to oversee the progress being made, offering up advice and instruction along the way. When it came to Tomorrowland, Walt wanted to showcase the innovations of the near future. At this time, freeways across California were being constructed, and Americans were excited to see a highway that featured no stops. It was this that inspired Walt to create an almost utopian auto motorway for Disneyland, and he would call it Autopia. Bob Gurr was fresh out of school for auto body design and was hired as an Imagineer for WED. Bob's first task was to design the cars for the Autopia, which was a task much more difficult than it seems. He needed a miniature car that could be operated by one pedal, could drive all day on low gear, withstand constant impacts without cracking the frame, and could be easily driven even by a child. This immediately required the transmission to withstand such rigorous work, especially with a modified clutch. But it was Bob's ability to think on the spot and offer insight that Walt would also appoint him to design other ride vehicle projects around the park. While vehicles gave Disneyland its motion, the wonder that the park would inspire was the result of the shape of its landscape. A Magic Kingdom with flat land doesn't leave much of an impression, especially considering that Walt didn't want the public to be able to see inside the park from the outside, and he didn't want the incredible landscapes within to be shattered by views of the surrounding city.
This was no place for a man with a hand shovel. Scooping out lakes and broad riverbeds paid off in enough dirt for rolling hills, islands, and mountains.
The massive amounts of dirt excavated from the ground were then used to create a system of berms that would surround the park, some of them towering 30 feet high. In fact, there was so much dirt that it would have cost too much money to move it off-site, so the extra earth was piled up next to the castle in a mound that was lovingly nicknamed Holiday Hill. Over in Frontierland, the Rivers of America was carved out and filled with water, only for crews to arrive the next day and find out all the water had soaked into the sandy Anaheim soil. Admiral Joe Fowler discovered a local clay, and he had the river lined with it to prevent the water from being absorbed into the ground. Anticipating the rapid development of Disneyland and businesses springing up along Harbor Boulevard, the city of Anaheim had to allocate 800 acres of land surrounding the park in order to provide it with public works. The farmers who had lived on the property before Disneyland had lived somewhat off-grid, without access to municipal water or gas, and some homes didn't even have electricity. Nearly 2 miles of clay pipe were laid down Harbor Boulevard to connect Disneyland with the city's wastewater sewage services. New power lines were erected to supply the park with enough power to light a small town. The only thing they didn't get from the city was a way to expel rainwater runoff. Admiral Joe Fowler suggested that Disneyland's gutters could drain into the man-made rivers and moats of the park, allowing these bodies of water to be topped off by seasonal rainfall. Even to this day, some of the original rainwater gutters still drain into the park's major outdoor waterways. Funds for Disneyland continued to run thin. Fowler explained that there may not be enough money to complete the Mark Twain riverboat. Walt mortgaged his remaining home to fund the completion of it. His wife Lily protested this, and of course he got into a heated argument with his brother. Roy pleaded that he consider postponing the opening of the park in order to ensure its proper completion. But Walt was adamant that he gave the public his word. The park would open on July 17th, come hell or high water. If it didn't, they might lose the confidence of all the creditors and sponsors, and the company would suffer as shareholders might pull out, causing a rippling effect that would doom the park and the studio. Disneyland was widely predicted to fail and take the Disney company down with it. But Walt stood firm. He'd been underestimated before, with Mickey Mouse and again with Snow White. In 1934, newspapers mocked the idea of a feature-length cartoon, calling Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs Walt's Folly. The film cost $1.5 million, 10 times the cost of a regular cartoon, and all that money was borrowed. Failure meant bankruptcy. Instead, Snow White premiered to huge success in 1937, earning $8 million upon its initial release. With the profits, Walt built a state-of-the-art studio in Burbank, complete with animation wings and an in-house animation school, air conditioning, and natural light, all designed to foster creativity and comfort. 2 decades later, that very studio was nearly paralyzed by the demands of building Disneyland. The studio temporarily halted animation as their top artists were reassigned to work on Disneyland. The company wasn't producing any live-action films either, because its sound stages were repurposed as fabrication sites for ride systems and special effects. Every dollar, every asset the company had was sunk into Disneyland. The Disney brothers had exhausted their personal finances, gambling it all on Walt's dream. Everything they had worked toward, everything they built over the last 27 years hung in the balance, entirely dependent on the success of what would become the world's first true theme park.
And I think that Roy has done a lot of things there against his better judgment because he felt that I wanted to do it.
To help speed up construction of the park, cutting-edge techniques were used. Parts of the buildings and their facades were prefabricated in the Opera House and installed in sections in their final location. This technique was prominently used for the installation of the towers and turrets of the castle, as well as the rooftops of Main Street Station, and even for constructing the Mark Twain riverboat. The layout of Disneyland was also something master-planned. Many amusement parks often tried to maximize land use by placing rides and buildings wherever space would allow, but Walt noticed that this resulted in people getting lost and walking unnecessary distances. Disneyland was designed in a spoke and wheel shape, with the various lands fanning out from the center. The park itself had only one exit, so that people wouldn't get confused about which way led to their car. And each land within the Magic Kingdom had only one entrance, ensuring that you couldn't get lost while inside Disneyland because all lands emptied back into the central plaza. Forced perspective was in heavy use at Disneyland, thanks to the artistry of the Imagineers who were used to designing film sets. Disney could use forced perspective for purposes other than decoration. Walt wanted guests entering the park to marvel at its size, so the building facades on the north end of Main Street were designed slightly shorter than the building facades at the south end, giving the illusion of distance. And this worked well in reverse too, because at the end of a tiring day, the guests would head back down Main Street, and the larger buildings at the south end made the exit of the park look closer than it really was. Forced perspective was also used on all the individual buildings as well. Walt wanted Disneyland to have charm, a sense that could be achieved with a miniature scale. This is why most buildings and park transportation systems, even to this day, are constructed in 5/8 scale. Although this is loosely followed since the various restaurants and gift shops, which may look multi-leveled, would actually be made from 3 different scales. The bottom level of most buildings in Disneyland are 9/10 of real size, while the second level is 5/8, and the third level, if any, is half scale. Essentially, as the buildings rise higher, the scale decreases with each level. The park's icon, Sleeping Beauty Castle, is designed in varying scales at random in order to throw off the observer's sense of size. This helped lend the castle's fairy tale appearance, although the paint job given to the castle was not one that Walt Disney or his Imagineers liked, but they didn't have time to dedicate to it, so they left it with a simple blue and gray color scheme, one that would haunt Imagineer John Hench for years afterward. As the final spire was lifted to the top of the castle, it officially became the tallest structure in Disneyland, towering 77 feet over Fantasyland. And it would maintain the title of the tallest structure in the park until Matterhorn would be added 4 years later. Walt insisted the finial caps on the rooftops of the castle turrets be gold-plated to impress park guests. Roy insisted it was too costly, so Walt ordered gold finials anyway. Roy would later admit the 24-karat gold finials indeed impressed park goers, and it was a good decision. With so little time and money to complete the park, Walt had to make do with some alterations to the plan. Fantasyland couldn't get its expensive fairy tale village look, so Imagineers settled for a medieval fair theme. Tomorrowland was the least complete area. They had to fill the empty buildings with random exhibits like the Bathroom of Tomorrow, and they even installed the sets left over from the production of Walt Disney's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea motion picture. Despite the numerous setbacks, the construction crews made up for it by tripling in size closer to the opening day. Many operations were going around the clock, and crews put in double shifts. Walt would walk the park having crews tweaking the appearance of things. He even asked Imagineer Bill Evans to move a 6-ton, 30-foot-wide pepper tree in Adventureland about 6 feet, just because it was too close to a park walkway. There are also images of a small bandstand gazebo that was moved to several locations, but in each one it blocked views. C.V. Wood was doing a great deal of work to keep the construction moving along swiftly, but the ethics of his tactics were sometimes questionable. Walt felt that Wood was only out to advance his own agenda. This caused the two men to often butt heads, and their relationship deteriorated to the point that soon after the park opened, Walt would fire him and erase his name from the company's history. On July 4, 1955, Walt held a U.S. Independence Day party at the nearly complete park. The main attraction was for his friends and company employees to get their first ride aboard the Disneyland Railroad, even though they could only ride part of the way around the park. The party concluded in the evening with fireworks in the sky. It would be the first fireworks show Disneyland ever had. Walt's Disneyland Railroad was the single most expensive attraction in the entire park, costing $240,000, but he insisted that it be built. He was a lifelong railroad enthusiast and even offered visitors rides on his backyard live-steam railroad he called the Carolwood Pacific. When Disneyland was in its early stages of design, he wanted the park to have its own railroad, which, aside from its miniature scale, would operate just as the old-fashioned puffers used to. A team of Imagineers, including Roger Broggie, Jerry Best, and Earl Vilmer, helped to scale up Walt's tiny Lilybell locomotive into 2 large steam engines that hauled authentic rolling stock. The 2 locomotives were built in 5/8 scale and ran on 3-foot narrow-gauge tracks, which were all hand-laid into the park. The CK Holiday engine number 1 fit perfectly at the Frontierland Depot with its freight train of cattle cars, gondolas, and caboose, while the EP Ripley engine number 2 was better suited for Main Street Station since it hauled a set of 6 passenger coaches. The 2 engines were named after 2 founding members of the Santa Fe Railway, the company that sponsored Disneyland's trains. Admiral Joe Fowler, with his experience building structures in the Navy's strict timelines, managed to have the railroad roundhouse constructed in under a week. On July 13, 1955, just 4 days before the park was unveiled to the public, Walt and his wife Lily celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary in the Golden Horseshoe Saloon in Frontierland. As Lillian was cutting the cake, Walt's peers cheered for him to make a speech, so he stood atop a chair to address the crowd. But as he stood there, beaming with pride and soaking in the view of all the happy faces looking back at him, he forgot to speak. For the first time, Walt got a glimpse of what his life's achievement would be like. An old Western saloon in the middle of a magic kingdom, filled with joyous grins and happy chatter. His daughter Sharon noticed tears in her father's eyes, and she went up and took him by the hand, encouraging him to make his speech. The night would end with an evening cruise aboard the Mark Twain riverboat as its paddle wheel churned the waters of the river. Joe Fowler would later find Lillian Disney cleaning up after the party. She had a broom in hand, and she swept the decks of the boat. Fowler grabbed another broom and joined her. On the night before Disneyland's grand opening, Walt Disney and his artist-turned-Imagineer Ken Anderson were in the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea exhibit in Tomorrowland. Ken was trying to get the giant squid to work, and Walt was busy painting the backdrop. But eventually Walt had to concede that it was getting late, and the exhibit would just have to wait to open another day. The 2 men parted ways, and Walt went to check on Main Street one last time before climbing up to his private apartment above the firehouse to tuck into bed for the night. The park was only mere hours away from being unveiled before the people of the world. Opening day had come. It was Sunday, July 17, 1955. Roy Disney had gotten up that morning after hardly getting any sleep. He knew that Walt and the ABC network had planned a live telecast of the opening day events. Nothing like this had ever been done before. Up until that day, the most television cameras ever used at a live event were 7. But in order to cover the grand scale of Disneyland, ABC had to borrow and rent cameras from other networks, giving a total of 29 television cameras, 80,000 feet of cable, and 14 improvised forklift camera platforms to deliver the festivities to a record-breaking viewership of 90 million across the country. Roy had started the drive from LA to Anaheim along the brand new 5 freeway. When he was only minutes from the park, he hit traffic. His heart skipped a beat as he wondered if there was freeway construction preventing people from getting to Disneyland. He made his way through the traffic. All the while, he worried that Walt's gamble on the park would cause the company they started 27 years earlier to go under and render their families homeless. As Roy exited onto Harbor Boulevard, he realized there was no freeway construction. The entire 7 miles of traffic he endured were for people waiting to park their cars at Disneyland. People were lined up at the front gates in the summer heat. Reporters were taking down notes with excited smiles on their faces, and happy children bounced with glee as they waited to see the magical kingdom within. Roy saw a panic-stricken parking lot manager and asked what was wrong. The manager explained that several buses of school kids had arrived after being stuck in traffic, and now all the boys were getting out and peeing in the parking lot. Roy himself was just so relieved that everyone showed up, he simply laughed and told the parking lot manager, "God bless them, let them pee." Walt had gotten cleaned up and dressed before the Mouseketeers arrived at his apartment to see the first guests streaming into Disneyland. Mouseketeer Sharon Baird recalled, "I was standing next to him at the window, watching the guests come pouring through the gates. When I looked up at him, he had his hands behind his back, a grin from ear to ear. I could see a lump in his throat and a tear streaming down his cheek. He had realized his dream." To host the live telecast, Walt asked Art Linkletter, who in turn asked his friends Bob Cummings and Ronald Reagan to be his co-hosts. Cables were strewn all over the park to connect the cameras with the temporary command center. Some cables were strung between buildings, some lay in the middle of walkways, and others were held up high in the air as construction cranes hoisted makeshift filming platforms to capture aerial views of Disneyland. The July heat reached 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Dry ice had to be fed into the cameras to keep them from overheating. Women's high heels were sinking into the asphalt, which in some areas had only just been poured earlier that morning. Actors missed their cues, and thirsty park-goers felt strong-armed into buying Pepsi and Coke products since a plumber's strike resulted in a lack of drinking fountains. No maximum capacity was established for the Mark Twain riverboat, which at one point filled with over 500 passengers, and as the boat rounded the bend in the river, water flowed over its lower deck. While Walt was being shuffled off from location to location for the telecast, more problems arose. Garbage was piling up backstage because the trucks never came to pick it up. Toilets in Adventureland overflowed. The park became uncomfortably overcrowded because although 11,000 invitations were issued, a flaw in the design allowed each guest to bring dozens of additional attendees. Other tickets were counterfeited and sold on the streets. In all, the park was packed with 28,000 people, which exceeded the capacity of Disneyland by 10,000. One man stood by the park fence with his ladder and charged a fee for people to use it to climb into the park. Soon, the food was running out. Autopia cars were breaking down, and there was a gas leak in Fantasyland that forced the closure of the rides for the rest of the day. This came as a relief to people who witnessed parents hoisting their children over the carousel barrier so they could get on the ride despite the long wait. The disasters kept mounting, and it all happened while Walt was being kept oblivious to the problems. By the end of the day, he was finally informed of all that had happened, and he was furious to say the least. He yelled and hollered for his Imagineers to repair the park and get it operating again in time for the public opening the next day. Despite the bad publicity and the press nicknaming the park's opening as Black Sunday, a name which Walt hated, the park continued to draw in hordes of visitors every day that summer. The public could see that Disneyland was a place like no other on Earth. average working class people were able to experience a cruise through the exotic jungles of the world, take a romantic journey aboard an authentic stern-wheeled steam riverboat, fly over London as Peter Pan, or even hear the sharp cry of a steam whistle as an 1800s locomotive hauled happy visitors around the Magic Kingdom. Disneyland was a success, and just 55 days after opening, its 1 millionth visitor passed through its turnstiles. That number today is closer to 800 million. When people wonder why Disneyland being styled as a theme park made it more successful than any other amusement park in the world, the answer is best referred to a quote by J.G. O'Boyle. "A theme park without rides is still a theme park. An amusement park without rides is a parking lot with popcorn." Walt's little park in Anaheim would become a quintessential part of Americana. Celebrities and heads of state from all over the world would visit Disneyland over the years. People don't just come because it has rides and characters, but because it was a way for people to escape their woes, if only for a day. Make no mistake, Southern California of the 1950s was not free from racism or segregation. This made it all the more poignant that Disneyland did not discriminate, and people of all races were welcomed. Evangelist Billy Graham was given a tour through Disneyland by Walt Disney himself. He asked Billy what he thought about the park being a place that brings people together, and Graham responded with what he thought was a compliment. "I think it's a wonderful fantasy world you've created here." This did not sit well with Walt, and he fired back saying, "Billy, look around you. Look at all the people, all nationalities, all languages, all smiling, all having fun together. This is the real world. The fantasy is out there, outside the park gates, where people have hatreds and prejudices. It's not real." Over the years, Walt would continue to change and add to the park. He was never satisfied with the status quo. He felt that there should always be a new reason for people to come, and new things for them to experience. He referred to Disneyland as his block of clay, which he could continuously keep sculpting and shaping to fit the image he wanted.
Well, Walt once said to me, "I dream that one day nobody shows up. That's my nightmare." He knew that the show had to be fresh, that there had to be a new reason to come back.
The first major park expansion happened in 1958 when the Disneyland Railroad received a station in Tomorrowland and a brand new finale to the Grand Circle tour of the park, with the addition of the Grand Canyon diorama. In 1959, the park held a grand reopening when new Fantasyland attractions were advertised along with 3 major e-ticket Tomorrowland attractions: the Matterhorn bobsleds, the world's first tubular steel roller coaster, the Submarine Voyage, the 8th largest submarine fleet in the world at the time, and the Disneyland Alweg monorail, the first daily operating monorail system in the Western Hemisphere. Increasing Disneyland's profit margins was not high on Walt's priorities. He often ran the park at great expense for the sake of a flawless experience. He did not see the visitors with dollar signs in his eyes. He saw them as his guests. This is evident in a situation witnessed by Imagineer Rolly Crump. Walt was in a meeting with several park managers, and in that meeting, the director of merchandise suggested installing t-shirt stands around the park to entice visitors into spending more money. Walt didn't like the idea. Later, the man brought up the subject again, and Walt refused him again. Frustrated and trying to make a point about increasing profitability, the man rebuffed his argument for a 3rd time. Walt cut him off, and though everyone in the company was on a first-name basis, Walt used the man's last name for emphasis. "Mr. Becker, the tail does not wag the dog." And that was that.
Just as we had to learn to make our animated cartoons talk, we had to find a way to make these characters talk too. Now, to accomplish this, we created a new type of animation. So new that we had to invent a new name for it.
Audio animatronics?
Right, audio animatronics.
In 1962, Walt had an idea for creating a Polynesian-themed tiki room, complete with mechanical birds in cages. This idea morphed into Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room, the world's first attraction to feature audio animatronics. This breakthrough in space-age technology allowed for WED Enterprises to participate in the 1964 New York World's Fair, where they created attractions like Ford's Magic Skyway, It's a Small World, the Carousel of Progress, and Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln. After the fair ended, Walt Disney had each attraction shipped back to Anaheim. The Carousel of Progress awaited a major Tomorrowland expansion. Mr. Lincoln gave speeches in the Main Street Opera House. The dinosaurs from Ford's Magic Skyway became the Primeval World diorama along the Disneyland Railroad. And last, but certainly not least, Walt Disney truly believed in the message of kindness and togetherness that It's a Small World delivered, and he enshrined the attraction with a magnificent and grand facade to make it stand out. On July 24, 1966, Walt Disney attended his last grand opening ceremony at Disneyland for his much-anticipated New Orleans Square, a land that would encapsulate the charm and elegance of the New Orleans French Quarter. Not only that, but the new area of the park would be home to two highly anticipated attractions. Ever since 1957, Walt had wanted a haunted house in his park, and work was finally underway to develop it. Over by Adventureland, New Orleans Square would house a massive pirate-themed adventure created by his Imagineers Claude Coates and Mark Davis. It was late that year, 1966, when Walt's older brother Roy, who was now 73 years old, had expressed that he wanted to retire. However, Walt had a lot of projects up in the air. Chief among them was his plan for a massive theme park and futuristic city in Florida. The company had purchased 47,000 acres, twice the size of the island of Manhattan, and Walt was going to forever seal his legacy in this experimental prototype community of tomorrow.
We call it Epcot, spelled E-P-C-O-T.
Walt admitted that he felt exhausted and gimpy himself, but he promised that as soon as they completed Disney World, they would both retire and enjoy the fruits of their labor. It turned out that Walt's exhaustion was the result of something much worse. In October of that year, Walt had X-ray photos taken of his old polo injury, and in those photos, his doctors had discovered a lump in his left lung the size of a walnut. They took him to surgery to remove it, and he was able to return to work, but he knew he wasn't feeling the same. Imagineer Mark Davis could hear Walt coming down the hallway into his office to check on the progress of Pirates of the Caribbean. Mark recalled, "His eyes were sunken and his appearance was gaunt. He listened to me give him the rundown, and after I was done, he said, 'That's good,' and as usual, he began to stroll out of my office. He usually would leave with a cheery wave and say, 'See you later.' But this time, he stopped at the doorway. He turned to look at me and he said, 'Goodbye, Mark.' And then he left. I was shocked because he never used to say goodbye. It was always 'see you later.' That was the last time I ever saw him." Walt had to return to the hospital in late November. He grew weaker and deteriorated to the point where he couldn't even celebrate his 65th birthday on December 5th. Things began to look up for a moment. His wife Lillian visited him on December 14th and phoned Roy, saying that Walt was feeling better. Roy visited Walt that night, and they ended up discussing the Disney World project. Walt feebly pointed up to the ceiling tiles, using them to reference the placement of various landmarks. Roy went home that night, happy to report to his wife Edna that Walt was improving. The next morning, December 15th, 1966, Walt Disney died. He was 65 years old. The family was informed of his passing, and Roy was the first family member on the scene. Walt's wife Lillian and their two daughters, Diane and Sharon, rushed to the hospital. Diane explained, "My mother went to enter the room, and she stopped at the doorway, holding her hands up in shock. I went in and found Dad laying peacefully in bed. My Uncle Roy was sitting at the foot of the bed, massaging Dad's feet. I think he said something like, 'Well, kid, I guess this is goodbye.' Everyone was in shock." Roy had returned to the studio later that day. He sat on the couch in his office and poured himself a drink. He reminisced to himself about his brother and their life together. But as his mind wandered back to the present, he realized that things weren't over. He thought about the company and all the projects currently in the works. Walt's final dreams were now on the line. He thought about the thousands of sad and confused employees of the company who would soon be driven into chaos if he had left them. What would happen to the company? What would happen to their jobs? He sat down at his desk to write out a memo to everyone in the company, assuring them that everything would continue on as Walt had guided it. Roy Disney declared at that moment he would postpone his retirement to oversee the completion of all the projects left behind, finishing with Walt's greatest ambition, the Florida project that he called Disney World. Amidst their mourning and their tears, the Imagineers pulled together to complete Pirates of the Caribbean in 1967. The attraction was so successful that it helped the park to quickly recover from its drop in attendance after Walt's death. Imagineer Alice Davis recalled, "Pirates of the Caribbean literally saved Disneyland." Richard Irvine, the head of Imagineering, was so impressed with Mark Davis and Claude Coates' work on Pirates that he put them in charge of Haunted Mansion, and once again, they created a wildly successful attraction debuting in 1969. The mansion was something that Walt would have been proud of. Also in 1967, the new Tomorrowland opened, featuring the Carousel of Progress, Adventure Through Inner Space, and the Wedway People Mover. That same year, work began on the Florida project, with Roy Disney himself at the helm. Roy had always been somewhat behind the scenes at the company. He ran the organization for his little brother and helped to make sure his dreams were financed. But now Roy found himself in a more creative role. It wasn't a position that came naturally for him, delegating tasks to Imagineers and overseeing creative development, but people around him said he truly shined in that moment. Walt's ideas for Epcot were not fully fleshed out, and so the company could not work on building his experimental community. Instead, Roy focused on building the theme park resort complex, plugging in ideas of his own, like replacing the plaza out front of the theme park with the massive 200-acre man-made Seven Seas Lagoon, which would give people good reason to ride the monorail or take a ferry boat to the main gates, adding to the sense of adventure. During one of the various meetings about the resort, Roy Disney announced that he was changing the name of Disney World to Walt Disney World, stating, "Everybody knows the Ford car, but not everybody knows it was Henry Ford who started it all. It's going to be Walt Disney World, so people will always know that this was Walt's dream." The opening day of the resort was fast approaching, and much like Disneyland's opening almost 2 decades earlier, Roy was told not everything would be complete. Roy had once asked Walt to delay the opening of Disneyland, and now executives were asking Roy to delay the opening of Walt Disney World. But he pointed up to the banner on Main Street Station, which read, "Remember, opening October 1971. Roy told everyone that he intended to keep that promise. When Walt had originally announced the Disney World project, Roy immediately supported it, which made another executive question Roy's sanity. Roy responded, "I had tuberculosis, and our finances were at worst ebb. My brother plucked us out of poverty and made me a millionaire. And you wonder why I would do anything I can to help him?"
And most of our arguments and disagreements, I think, have been because Roy has felt that he had to protect me.
Though Walt had opened Disneyland in 1955 at a debt of $10 million, Roy opened Walt Disney World at a cost of $400 million, and the company was without any outstanding debt. Imagineer John Hench recalled the opening day. Roy Disney stood facing the microphone before a crowd of guests ready to deliver the dedication speech at the opening ceremony. He suddenly turned and looked around, and I heard him say quietly, "Somebody go find Mickey for me. We don't have Walt anymore, and Mickey is the nearest thing to Walt that we have left." Mickey appeared, and Roy promptly began his speech with Mickey standing proudly at his side. Indeed, Mickey understood the gravity of his presence at that moment, and instead of happily waving at guests and jumping excitedly, he stood respectfully, hands folded.
Walt Disney World is a tribute to the philosophy and the life of Walter Elias Disney.
Roy Disney had accomplished the impossible. Despite his advanced age, he took up the mantle and gave it everything he had left, and never quit. In doing so, he had honored the memory and legacy of his brother. It was a grand gesture of thanks for all the success and love that Walt had brought to Roy's life. He went home to California and intended to gradually retire from the company and leave it in the hands of Walt's most capable leaders. Roy's wife and son returned home one evening to find him lying on the floor in a daze. An ambulance took him to the hospital, where Roy Oliver Disney died the next day, December 20th, 1971, of an intracranial hemorrhage. Just 2 months after opening Walt Disney World. He was 78 years old. Walt and Roy started with nothing, and over the course of 48 years they built an empire dedicated not only to pushing the boundary of creativity, but also to give the world a way to spend a wholesome time together. Walt Disney never saw the completion of Walt Disney World, but his legacy and spirit live on at his original Magic Kingdom of Disneyland. It was often said that everything Walt did had turned to gold. Not only were his ideas lucrative, but people developed a deep emotional attachment to his various projects. Imagineer Rolly Crump said it best.
See, this was Walt's secret. He touched everybody with everything that he did.
Walt Disney created Disneyland because he strongly felt that there should be a place where parents and children could have fun together. It was a magical kingdom where you could travel the world through time and fantasy, joined by your favorite characters on exciting adventures, built all those years ago by the man who made us all believe that when you wish upon a star, your dreams can come true. Because at least they did for him.